It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Give me the keys, Sloane snapped, her palm upturned and demanding as she eyed Cassandra with a sneer. You don't look like you belong in a car like this anyway. Cassandra Vance stood perfectly still in the center of the sprawling Vance estate driveway. The sunset cast long, jagged shadows across the gravel, but the heat radiating from her sister's arrogance felt far more oppressive than the humid evening air. In her hand, the key fob to the limited edition Aston Martin, a car Cassandra had purchased with her own year-end bonus, felt like a heavy secret. This isn't a company car, Sloane, Cassandra said, her voice a calm, low contrast to her sister's shrill entitlement. It's mine. I earned it. Sloane laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that seemed to vibrate against the pristine white columns of the mansion. She stepped closer, the cloying scent of her jasmine perfume filling the space between them. Earned it? You're a glorified bookkeeper, Cassie. You sit in a dark office and move numbers around while I'm out there being the face of this family. Daddy said I needed a car that matches my status for the gala tonight. Now, hand them over before I make this difficult. The sharp, rhythmic strike of Sloane's designer stilettos against the Italian marble steps announced a new arrival before he even spoke. Arthur Vance stepped into the light of the foyer, his tuxedo pressed to a razor edge, his expression already set in a mask of disappointment directed solely at his eldest daughter. Cassandra, don't be tedious, Arthur said, checking his gold Rolex without looking up. Your sister has a high-profile meeting with the Montgomery heirs tonight. She needs to project the right image. You can take the SUV. The SUV is for the staff, Father, Cassandra replied, her heart rate steady despite the familiar sting of betrayal. And I have the Thorne merger documents to finalize tonight, the ones that are currently keeping Vance Global from insolvency. Arthur finally looked at her, his eyes cold and dismissive. The Thorne merger is a team effort. Sloane's social networking did more for that deal than your spreadsheets ever could. Give her the keys. That's an order. Sloane smirked, her fingers twitching in anticipation. With a slow, deliberate motion, Cassandra dropped the keys into her sister's hand. She watched as Sloane didn't even offer a thank you, instead spinning on her heel and strutting toward the sleek silver vehicle. Try not to get any grease on the seats, Cassie, Sloane called out over her shoulder. Oh, wait, you won't be in it. My mistake. Cassandra watched the taillights disappear down the long, winding drive. She didn't move until the sound of the engine faded into the distance. The icy condensation from her water glass, which she had been carrying from the kitchen, seeped into her palm, a grounding chill. Inside the house, the preparations for the Vance Global Anniversary Gala were reaching a fever pitch. Layla Montgomery, the senior receptionist and one of the few people in the building who actually saw the hours Cassandra put in, hurried past with a stack of seating charts. She paused, casting a sympathetic look at Cassandra. She took the car, didn't she? Layla whispered, glancing toward the foyer to ensure Arthur was out of earshot. She took a lot more than that, Layla, Cassandra murmured. Did you get the files from the offshore audit? Layla nodded quickly, her voice barely audible. Everything. Your father's signatures are all over the mismanaged accounts, and Sloane's consulting fees are documented right next to them. It's all in the secure folder. Good, Cassandra said, a small ghost of a smile touching her lips. Go home, Layla. You don't want to be here when the music stops. Cassandra walked toward the library, her footsteps silent on the thick Persian rugs. She found Arthur in his study, pouring a glass of 20-year-old scotch. He didn't look up as she entered. I hope you're going to change before the guests arrive, he said, his tone dripping with boredom. Something less, functional, try to look like a Vance for once. I've been looking like a Vance for 30 years, Father, Cassandra said, standing by the window. The problem is I'm the only one who's been doing the work. Arthur finally looked at her, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. What is that supposed to mean? It means that while you were busy grooming Sloane to be a socialite, and Sloane was busy spending the company's liquid assets on her wardrobe, I was quietly restructuring the debt, she said, her voice as cold as the marble floors. The Thorne merger, Arthur scoffed. We've already discussed this. We haven't, Cassandra corrected. Julian Thorne didn't sign a merger agreement with Vance Global. He signed a ghost sale. He bought the underlying assets of the company, the land, the patents, the name, 3 hours ago, and he bought them from the holding company I established last year. Arthur's glass paused midair. The color began to drain from his face, a slow, satisfying retreat. You don't have the authority. I have the power of attorney you signed when you were too drunk to read the fine print last Christmas, she said. She reached into her blazer pocket, her fingers brushing the cold, metallic edge of the encrypted drive. Vance Global is a hollow shell, Father. By the time the gala starts tonight, you and Sloane won't own the chairs you're sitting on. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the distant chime of the grandfather clock in the hall. Cassandra didn't wait for him to find his breath. She turned and walked out of the study, her heels clicking with a new, predatory rhythm. She stepped out onto the porch, the evening air finally cooling. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. Julian, she said, her voice a low, steady blade. Execute the final transfer. I want the foundations pulled by Monday. And tell Detective Miller to be ready. Sloane's consulting paper trail is ready for review. She hung up and looked out over the dark expanse of the estate. The lion had been sleeping for a long time, but the hunt had finally begun. The next morning, the executive floor of Vance Global was already buzzing with the frantic energy of a hive under threat. Cassandra walked through the glass doors at 8:00 a.m. sharp, her heels clicking a steady, unbothered rhythm against the white marble. She didn't need to look at the reception desk to know the staff was whispering. The air was thick with the scent of Sloane's signature jasmine perfume, a cloying, expensive aroma that usually signaled an impending tantrum. Cassandra reached her office and stopped. The door was propped open with a trash can. Inside, Sloane Vance was draped over the mahogany desk, her designer heels scuffing the polished wood as she directed 2 maintenance men. They were hauling out Cassandra's ergonomic chair and replacing it with a velvet-tufted monstrosity in a garish shade of flamingo pink. "What is this?" Cassandra asked, her voice a calm, cool blade cutting through the noise. Sloane didn't look up from her phone, her thumb flicking through a social media feed with practiced indifference. "It's an optimization, sweetie. This office has the best natural light for my new Vance Vision live streams. I've already had your things moved to the 4th floor. There's a lovely cubicle right next to the server room. It's very industrial. It suits your aesthetic." Cassandra watched as one of the men picked up a crystal award she had won for the Vance-Holden merger. He looked at Sloane, who gave a dismissive wave of her manicured hand. The man set it carelessly on top of a pile of discarded files. It tipped, sliding off the edge and hitting the floor with a sharp, sickening crack. "Oops," Sloane smirked, finally meeting her sister's gaze. Her eyes were bright with a cruel, petty triumph. "I suppose some things just aren't as durable as they look. Don't worry about the mess. The janitor will be up eventually." "Cassandra, stop hovering." Arthur Vance stepped into the room, his silk tie perfectly knotted, his expression one of bored irritation. He didn't even glance at the shattered crystal on the floor. "Your sister is the face of the new Vance rebranding. She needs the right environment to project success. You've always been better at the invisible work anyway. Go downstairs and finish the quarterly projections. Stay in the shadows where you're useful." Cassandra felt the cold weight of the encrypted drive in her blazer pocket, the one containing the ghost sale records Julian Thorne had finalized at midnight. She looked at her father, seeing the hollow shell of a man who didn't realize he'd already signed away the building's lease to a holding company he couldn't even name. She didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She simply nodded. "I understand perfectly, Father," she said. She turned and walked toward the break room, the smell of Sloane's suffocating perfume following her like a shroud. Inside, the industrial coffee machine hummed with a low, metallic vibration. Layla Montgomery was already there, pretending to clean the espresso nozzles. As Cassandra approached, the receptionist slid a small, folded slip of paper across the granite counter. "The transfer logs are confirmed," Layla whispered, her voice barely audible over the hiss of steam. Arthur moved the last of the liquid pension assets into Sloane's consulting account 10 minutes ago. He thinks the trail is buried under 3 layers of shell companies. Cassandra took the paper, her fingers brushing the cool, damp surface of the counter. He's always been overconfident in his own complexity. Thank you, Layla. Make sure your personal files are backed up on a private cloud by noon. When the foundations pull, I don't want your hard work disappearing with theirs. The Founders' Gala is in 6 hours, Sloane shouted from the hallway, her voice dripping with unearned authority as she barked orders at a decorator. Cassandra, don't bother showing up. I've had your name removed from the VIP guest list. We wouldn't want a cubicle worker bringing down the energy of the room. Cassandra took a slow, deliberate sip of her black coffee, the bitter heat grounding her. She looked at the digital clock on the wall. 6 hours. She pulled out her phone and sent a brief, encrypted message to Julian. The bait is taken. Execute the final lien. Let them have their party. She watched the delivered icon appear. Sloane was currently laughing in the office Cassandra had built, unaware that the very floor beneath her expensive heels was no longer hers to stand on. The countdown had reached its final stretch, and for the first time in years, Cassandra felt the predatory thrill of the hunt. She turned toward the elevators, leaving the jasmine-scented chaos behind. The cubicle by the server room would be perfect. It was the best place in the building to watch a digital empire burn in silence. 2 days had passed since the elevators at Vance Global had closed on the image of Sloane's smug, victorious grin. Cassandra stood in the quiet, mahogany-paneled sanctuary of Julian Thorne's private study, the rhythmic, heavy ticking of a grandfather clock the only sound in the room. The air here smelled of aged parchment and the faint, sharp tang of expensive scotch, a stark contrast to the sterile, fluorescent-lit cubicle she had occupied for the last 48 hours. Julian slid a heavy, cream-colored folder across the polished desk. It's official, Cassandra. The ghost sale is finalized. The holding company, your company, now holds the primary debt and the ground lease for the entire Vance headquarters. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cool, embossed seal on the top document. It was a tactile victory, the weight of the bond paper grounding her. The ink was fresh enough to leave a faint, metallic scent on her skin. And the board. They're still in the dark, he said, a predatory glint in his eyes. Arthur thinks the anonymous investor is a silent partner who's going to bail out his latest expansion. He has no idea he just handed the keys to the woman he sidelined. Good, she replied, her voice a low, steady hum. Let him keep dreaming for another 24 hours. Arrogance is a heavy sleeper. Later that afternoon, she stopped at a high-end bistro near the office to grab a quick salad. The universe, it seemed, was determined to provide her with one final dose of motivation. Sloane was already there, seated at a center table and holding court with 3 other socialites. They were draped in silk and loud jewelry, their laughter cutting through the sophisticated atmosphere of the room like a jagged blade. Well, if it isn't the office ghost, Sloane called out, not bothering to lower her voice as she noticed her sister. She gestured toward her with a manicured hand, her diamonds flashing under the bistro's crystal chandeliers. I heard you've been spending a lot of time in the server room. Does the static hair come with the job, or is that just your new look? It's very industrial. The women at the table erupted in synchronized giggles. Cassandra felt the familiar heat of a rage spike, her pulse quickening against the collar of her modest blazer. She noticed the bottle of vintage champagne chilling in a silver bucket on their table, a celebration of a victory that hadn't actually happened yet. I'm just making sure everything is in order for the gala tomorrow, Sloane, she said, her tone deceptively mild, her face a mask of professional indifference. Don't worry about the gala, her sister snapped, her eyes narrowing as she took a slow, deliberate sip of her drink. I told you, I've had your name scrubbed. You don't have the status to be in that room, and frankly, you don't have the dress. Try not to cry too hard when you see the highlights on social media. Cassandra didn't look away. She let the silence stretch until her sister's smirk faltered just a fraction. Status is a fickle thing, Sloane. It can vanish faster than bubbles in a glass. Enjoy the vintage while it lasts. She turned and walked away before the other woman could respond, the sound of an indignant huff following her out into the humid afternoon air. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place an hour later. She met Layla Montgomery in the shadow of a large stone fountain at the edge of the city park. The receptionist looked pale, her eyes darting nervously toward the passing joggers. She handed over a small, encrypted flash drive, her hand trembling slightly as it brushed Cassandra's. "It's all there," Layla whispered, her voice barely audible over the splashing water. "The private ledger Arthur keeps in the home safe. He's been diverting company pension funds to cover Sloane's failed lifestyle brand for the last 18 months. He thinks he can replace it once the merger goes through." Cassandra tucked the drive into the hidden inner pocket of her bag. "You're doing the right thing, Layla. Just be at your desk tomorrow morning. Don't answer any calls from the executive suite after 10 o'clock. What's going to happen?" "Justice," she said, the word tasting like cold iron. She returned to the Vance estate that evening to retrieve the last of her personal files. She found Arthur Vance in the library, his back to her as he poured a glass of amber liquid. He looked up, his expression hardening the moment he saw her standing in the doorway. "I thought I told you to stay at the office until the transition was complete," he said, his voice dripping with the casual contempt he usually reserved for failing vendors. "I'm leaving, Father. I just came for my things." He set the glass down with a heavy, echoing clink on the marble coaster. "Good. Your attitude has been a distraction to the team. Sloane is the one with the instinct for this business. She understands that image is everything in this town. You're just a technician, Cassandra. Technicians are replaceable. Visionaries are not." She stood in the doorway, the shadow of the hallway swallowing her frame. She felt the sharp corner of the deed folder in her bag, a secret power that made his insults feel like distant static. "You're right about one thing. Image is everything. I hope yours is sturdy enough to survive the storm." He waved her off with a dismissive flick of his wrist, already turning back to his reflection in the window. He had no idea the foundation of his empire was already turning to ash beneath his feet. Back in her small apartment, Cassandra sat at her kitchen table. The evidence was laid out like a deck of cards. The land deed, the forged signatures, the diverted funds. The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight, counting down the final hours of the Vance dynasty. Her phone buzzed on the table. A text from Julian. "The board meeting is confirmed for 10:00 a.m. The press release is drafted. Are you ready to pull the trigger?" Cassandra looked at the documents one last time. 18 hours until the board meeting. 28 hours until the gala. She felt a cold, sharp thrill run down her spine as she picked up the phone. "I'm ready," she typed back. "Don't just pull the trigger. Level the building." The morning of the board meetings, Eve arrived with a deceptive, silver stillness that masked the rot beneath the Vance global headquarters. Cassandra Vance stepped through the glass doors at 8 o'clock sharp, her footsteps muffled by the plush, charcoal carpeting of the executive suite. She carried a single, slim leather portfolio, the weight of it feeling heavier than the millions of dollars it represented in stolen equity. Arthur Vance was already in his corner office, the scent of expensive cedarwood and oversteeped espresso clinging to the air like a shroud. He didn't look up as she entered, his attention fixed on a series of architectural renderings for the new development, the very project built on the land he'd illegally seized from her mother's estate. "You're early," he remarked, his voice like dry parchment. "I hope you've prepared the transition documents. After tomorrow's vote, I want your desk cleared by noon." Before she could respond, the rhythmic, predatory click of stilettos announced Sloane Vance's arrival. She swept into the room, draped in a silk blouse that cost more than most people's monthly rent. She leaned against the mahogany desk, her eyes raking over her sister's tailored but modest navy suit with a sneer of pure, unfiltered contempt. "Still wearing the uniform of the help, I see," Sloane said, her voice dripping with the entitlement of a woman who had never earned a single thing in her life. "Honestly, Arthur, It's embarrassing. How are we supposed to present a united front to the board when she looks like she's here to restock the printer paper? Cassandra didn't flinch. She simply adjusted the folder in her grip, feeling the sharp edge of the forged deed through the leather. Clothes can be replaced, Sloane. Reputation, however, is a bit more fragile. Once it's stained, the marks never really come out. Sloane let out a sharp, jagged laugh. Spoken like someone who knows she's already lost. You're a footnote, Cassandra. A rounding error in the Vance legacy. Tomorrow, we're making it official. You're out, and I'm taking your seat on the committee. Arthur finally looked up, his gaze cold and devoid of any paternal warmth. It's for the best. You don't have the stomach for what this company requires. You're too much like your mother, soft and obsessed with fairness in a world that only respects power. I've learned a lot about power lately, she said quietly. She walked toward the door, stopping just long enough to look her father in the eye. A house built on sand doesn't need a storm to fall, Arthur. It just needs the tide to turn. You should check the foundation of the West End deal one last time before the meeting. You might find it's not as solid as you think. Arthur waved her off with a dismissive flick of his gold-ringed hand. The foundation is solid. I built it myself. Now leave. I have a gala to prepare for, and a legacy to secure. As she stepped back into the hallway, she caught the eye of Layla Montgomery at the reception desk. Layla looked down quickly, but not before a flicker of recognition passed between them. She had been the one to provide the final time-stamped logs of Arthur's late-night document shredding. She knew the storm wasn't coming. It was already inside the building, silent and inevitable. Cassandra's phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from Julian Thorne. The final injunction is signed. The press gallery is confirmed. Sleep well. Tomorrow the world watches them burn. She looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city below. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the glass towers. 12 hours until the board meeting, 22 hours until the gala. She felt a strange, icy calm settle over her. For years, they had treated her like a ghost in her own home. Tomorrow, she would finally show them how much damage a ghost could do. She didn't head to her desk. Instead, she walked to the elevator, her reflection in the polished steel doors looking like someone she barely recognized. Someone who wasn't just surviving the Vance legacy, but ending it. The elevator chimed, a lonely, final sound in the empty hall, counting down the seconds until the first domino fell. The evening arrived with a suffocating humidity that clung to the manicured hedges of the Vance estate. The so-called wellness retreat was in full swing, though the only thing being nurtured was Arthur's ego. Rows of white silk tents lined the lawn, and the scent of crushed gardenias mixed with the metallic tang of expensive champagne. Cassandra stood on the periphery of the terrace, her fingers tracing the smooth, cold edge of the silver clutch that held her phone, and the digital keys to the Vance empire's destruction. She watched the guests, a sea of high society vultures in linen and lace, all laughing at jokes that weren't funny. They were the witnesses she needed. Every board member, every major investor, and every socialite who had spent years looking through her as if she were part of the furniture was present. You're standing in the shadows again, Cassandra. It's really your natural habitat, isn't it? Sloane stepped into the light of the terrace lanterns, her movements sharp and predatory. She was draped in a gold-sequined gown that probably cost more than the annual salary of the woman who had sewn it. She swirled a crystal flute, her eyes scanning her sister with a mixture of pity and boredom. I was just enjoying the view, Cassandra replied, her voice a flat, steady line. Sloane laughed, a brittle sound that cut through the soft melody of the string quartet playing near the rose garden. The view? You mean the empire you'll never lead? Honestly, I don't know why you even showed up. You look like a funeral director in that dress. It's a wellness retreat, not a mourning period for your failed career. She leaned in closer, the smell of her heavy, cloying perfume, something rare and overpriced, filling the space between them. Actually, be a dear and go find the catering lead. They're running low on the Wagyu sliders, and you already look like part of the staff. You might as well be useful for once. The audacity was a physical weight, but Cassandra didn't flinch. She simply adjusted the strap of her bag. I'll make sure everyone gets exactly what they have coming to them, Sloane. Don't worry about the service. Sloane rolled her eyes and turned away, dismissive as always. Just stay out of the photos. Arthur wants the focus on the future of the company tonight, and that means me. Cassandra watched her sister glide toward a group of investors, her golden dress shimmering like a warning. She felt a vibration in her palm. A text from Julian Thorne. The secondary accounts are frozen. The board has no idea their personal guarantees are being called in at dawn. Enjoy the party. A few yards away, near the heavy oak doors of the study, she spotted Layla Montgomery. The receptionist looked pale, her hands trembling as she held a tray of hors d'oeuvres, but when her eyes met Cassandra's, she gave a microscopic nod. The evidence was in place. The physical files Layla had pulled from Arthur's private safe were already in Julian's hands. Cassandra moved through the crowd, a ghost in a room full of people who thought they were immortal. She passed Arthur Vance, who was holding court near the fountain. He looked every bit the patriarch, silver-haired, tan, and radiating a sense of absolute authority. He was currently regaling a group of board members with the story of the Vance family's unbreakable legacy. The strength of a dynasty isn't just in its assets, Arthur said, his voice booming with practiced charisma. It's in the blood. It's in the hand that holds the wheel. He caught sight of Cassandra, and his smile didn't even reach his eyes. It was a brief, obligatory acknowledgement before he turned back to his audience. And tomorrow, at the board meeting, we'll be announcing a restructuring that ensures that wheel stays in the right hands. Sloane has shown the kind of vision this company needs to move into the next decade. One of the board members, a man named Henderson who had known Cassandra since she was a child, looked over at her with a flicker of something like guilt. But it vanished the moment Arthur clapped him on the shoulder. The hierarchy was set. The daughter who did the work was being erased in favor of the daughter who wore the gold. "Are you sure about that, Father?" Cassandra asked, her voice quiet but carrying a strange, chilling resonance. The group went silent. Arthur's brow furrowed, his annoyance bubbling just beneath the surface of his polished exterior. "Are you questioning the strategy, Cassandra? Now, in front of our guests?" "Not at all," she said, stepping forward. The light of the chandeliers caught the icy blue of her eyes. "I just think the right hands might be a matter of perspective. I'm looking forward to tomorrow's meeting. It's going to be illuminating." Arthur let out a short, dismissive huff. "Your theatrics are tiresome. Go get a drink and try to act like a Vance for at least one evening." He turned his back on her, a final, public dismissal. Cassandra didn't stay to watch him finish his toast. She walked toward the edge of the estate, where the darkness of the woods met the glow of the party. Near the gate, she saw a dark sedan idling. A man in a plain suit stood by the fender, watching the house with a clinical, detached interest. It was Detective Miller. He wasn't there to join the party. He was there to scope the exits. Cassandra turned back to look at the house. From here, the Vance estate looked like a palace of light and glass. It looked invincible. She thought about the documents Julian had filed, the ghost sale that had quietly stripped the land from under the foundation, and the financial crimes Sloane had committed with Arthur's silent approval. She felt no pity, only a cold, crystalline sense of purpose. The countdown had reached its final hours. The board members were drinking the last of the vintage wine they thought they owned. Sloane was practicing her victory speech in her head. Arthur was dreaming of a legacy that had already been sold. Cassandra pulled her phone from her clutch and sent a single word to Julian: "Proceed." She looked up at the moon, the air finally beginning to cool. Tomorrow, the sun would rise on a board meeting that would end a dynasty. Tomorrow, the world would watch them burn, and she would be the one holding the match. She didn't head back to the tents. Instead, she walked toward her modest car parked at the far end of the drive, the sound of the string quartet fading into the distance like a dying breath. The stage was set, the witnesses were gathered, and the first domino was already in the air, waiting for the gravity of the truth to pull it down. The following morning, the air in the Vance Global boardroom was thick with the scent of expensive roast coffee and the sterile hum of a high-end climate control system. Cassandra Vance stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city wake up far below. She felt a strange, detached calm like the eye of a storm. Behind her, the heavy oak doors swung open, and the room filled with the sharp, rhythmic clicking of heels and the low murmur of self-important men. Arthur Vance took his place at the head of the table, his posture radiating a desperate kind of authority. Sloane Vance sat to his right, already smirking as she adjusted the sleeves of her cream-colored blazer. She didn't even look at her sister until she'd settled into her leather chair. "Still here, Cassandra?" Sloane asked, her voice dripping with a casual, practiced cruelty. She leaned back, tapping a manicured nail against the polished mahogany. "I thought you'd have packed your desk by now. Or did you think showing up to the execution would earn you a mercy severance?" Arthur cleared his throat, refusing to meet his eldest daughter's gaze. "Let's get this over with. We have the merger papers ready for the final vote. Cassandra, you're only here as a formality because of your minor shares." "Sit down and stay quiet." Cassandra didn't sit. She remained standing, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. "I'm not here for a severance, Arthur, and there won't be a merger." Sloane let out a sharp, jagged laugh that echoed off the glass walls. "Oh, the delusion is finally setting in. Dad, can we just call security? She's embarrassing herself." The board members shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between the sisters. Just as Arthur opened his mouth to speak, the doors opened again. Julian Thorne walked in, his face a mask of professional ice, carrying a slim leather briefcase. He didn't look at the board, he walked straight to Cassandra and handed her a single, heavy folder. "Everything is verified," Julian said, his voice cutting through the room's tension like a blade. "The filings are complete." "What is this?" Arthur demanded, his face reddening. "Thorne, you don't represent this board. He represents the owner of the debt you used to leverage this merger," Cassandra said quietly. She stepped forward and slid a document across the table. It stopped directly in front of Sloane. The room went deathly silent. Sloane's expression didn't just change, it disintegrated. The practiced porcelain mask of her arrogance shattered, leaving behind a frantic, pale emptiness. Her eyes, usually sharp with malice, widened until the whites showed all the way around the irises, darting between the documents and her father like a trapped animal. A blotchy, frantic red climbed her throat, clashing violently with her designer blazer, while her mouth hung open in a silent, ugly her breathing became a series of ragged, audible hitches, and the hand she'd used to mock Cassandra just moments ago began to tremble so violently that her heavy diamond ring clattered against the mahogany table. Arthur leaned over, his eyes scanning the page. His face went gray. This is a total buyout of the holding company, but that's impossible. We were told the buyer was an anonymous offshore group." "I am the group," Cassandra said. Her voice was steady, devoid of the anger they expected. "I've been buying back the diluted shares you threw away for years. I own the land this building sits on, the patents your engineers developed, and as of 9 o'clock this morning, I own the controlling interest in Vance Global." One of the senior board members gasped, leaning forward to squint at the signature on the deed. Another pulled his chair back, the screech of wood on carpet sounding like a scream. Across the room, Layla Montgomery stood by the door, her arms crossed, a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips as she watched the dynasty crumble. Sloane finally found her voice, though it was thin and shrill. "You can't do this. This is our legacy. Dad, tell her. She's lying, she has to be lying." She lunged for the papers, her movements clumsy and desperate, but Julian stepped in the way with a cold, dismissing look. Cassandra looked at her sister, seeing the terror behind the vanity for the first time. "You spent your life trying to convince everyone I didn't belong in this room, Sloane. You told me I was just a ghost in your house." "Well, the ghost just bought the house." She turned to the board, her gaze lingering on the men who had spent years ignoring her. "The merger is canceled. Arthur, your retirement is effective immediately. Sloane, you have 1 hour to clear your office before security escorts you from the premises." "You can't fire me," Sloane screamed, her voice cracking as she looked around the room for an ally. But the board members were already looking away, their loyalties shifting to the new power in the room with sickening speed. Arthur sat slumped in his chair, looking every bit the old man he had become. Cassandra didn't wait for the tears or the pleading. She turned toward the door, her coat swirling around her ankles. "I'll be in the CEO's office. Don't bother knocking." She walked out, the sound of Sloane's hysterical denials fading behind the heavy doors. As she reached the elevators, she saw Detective Miller standing in the lobby, a pair of silver handcuffs glinting against his dark suit. He gave her a sharp nod. The financial audit was just the beginning, and the real reckoning was only minutes away. 10 minutes had passed since the heavy oak doors of the boardroom had swung shut behind Cassandra Vance, but the air in the executive lobby still vibrated with the aftershocks of the collapse. The sterile scent of lemon polish and expensive industrial air filters couldn't mask the sudden, sharp tang of ozone and desperation. Cassandra stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, her silhouette sharp against the city skyline. She didn't feel the triumph she had expected. Instead, she felt a profound, icy clarity. Behind her, the elevator chimes rang out, a cheerful, melodic sound that felt grotesquely out of place. Sloane Vance stumbled out of the boardroom, her heels clicking erratically against the marble. Her designer blazer was bunched at the shoulders, and her hair, usually a lacquered helmet of perfection, had begun to fray at the temples. "You think you've won?" Sloane spat, her voice echoing off the glass walls. She marched toward Cassandra, her finger trembling as she pointed it. "You've spent your whole life playing the martyr, Cassie, but you're just a thief. You stole this company from Dad. You stole my future. I'll have every lawyer in the tri-state area stripping you of those shares by midnight." Cassandra didn't turn around. She watched Sloane's reflection in the glass, a distorted, frantic image of the sister who had spent a decade treating her like a stepping stone. "The lawyers are already here, Sloane, but they aren't here for me." As if on cue, Detective Miller stepped forward from the shadow of the reception alcove. The silver handcuffs hanging from his belt caught the harsh overhead LEDs, glinting with a cold, rhythmic promise. Julian Thorne stood beside him, clutching a leather briefcase that contained the final nails in the coffin of the Vance legacy. "Sloane Vance," Miller's voice was a low, steady rumble. "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of wire fraud, embezzlement, and the falsification of corporate records." Sloane's face underwent a violent transformation. Her eyes bulged, the pupils shrinking to pinpricks of pure terror as the reality of the metal restraints sank in. The vibrant, healthy glow she cultivated with expensive facials vanished, replaced by a sallow, sickly gray that made her look 10 years older in a heartbeat. Her jaw didn't just drop. It hung slack, her mouth working wordlessly like a fish pulled from water, while a thin sheen of cold sweat broke out across her forehead. The polished mask of the Vance heiress didn't just crack, it disintegrated, leaving behind a sallow, trembling woman who realized, for the first time in her life, that her name was no longer a shield. Her breath came in shallow, jagged hitches that whistled in the sudden silence of the lobby. "This is a mistake," Sloane finally croaked, her voice thin and reedy. She looked around the room, her gaze landing on Layla Montgomery, who stood by the reception desk. Layla didn't look away this time. She held Sloane's gaze with a steady, quiet dignity, holding the digital recorder that had captured months of Sloane's whispered threats and illegal directives. Arthur Vance emerged from the boardroom then, looking like a man who had aged 20 years in 20 minutes. He leaned heavily on his cane, his knuckles white. He looked at his favorite daughter, the one he had championed at Cassandra's expense, and then he looked at the floor. He didn't move to help her. He didn't even speak. The silence from her father seemed to hit Sloane harder than the detective's words. Julian stepped forward, opening his briefcase to reveal a stack of documents. "The ghost sale you thought you were facilitating to hide the company's liabilities was actually a direct transfer of personal debt into your name, Sloane. You signed the documents without reading the fine print because you were too eager to see Cassandra lose. You didn't just commit fraud, you signed a confession." A group of junior analysts had gathered at the far end of the hall, their whispers a low hiss of static. They watched as Miller stepped closer to Sloane. One of them, a young woman Sloane had once brought to tears over a coffee order, pulled out her phone, the screen glowing as she recorded the fall of the Queen. "Handcuffs," Sloane whispered, her voice cracking. "In front of everyone." "Especially in front of everyone," Cassandra said, finally turning to face her sister. She walked closer, her footsteps measured and calm. The scent of Julian's cedarwood cologne drifted past her, a grounding, masculine anchor in the chaos. She stopped inches from Sloane, looking down at the woman who had spent years trying to diminish her. "You always told me I didn't belong in this world, Sloane. You said I was just the help with a shared last name." Cassandra reached out, gently straightening Sloane's crooked lapel. The fabric felt cold and synthetic under her fingers. "You spent so much time trying to steal my life, Sloane, that you forgot to live your own," Cassandra said, her voice a frost-covered blade. "Now, the state will be managing your schedule for the foreseeable future. I've already arranged for your things to be moved out of the penthouse. It turns out the lease was held by a subsidiary I purchased this morning." Miller reached for Sloane's wrists. The sharp, metallic clack-clack of the handcuffs ratcheting shut was the loudest sound in the room. Sloane let out a small, pathetic whimper, a sound so devoid of her usual ego that even Arthur winced. Cassandra didn't wait to see her sister led to the elevators. She didn't wait for Arthur to find his voice or for the board members to offer their hollow apologies. She turned her back on the wreckage of her family and walked toward the private exit. As the elevator doors began to close on the lobby, she saw Sloane being marched toward the public exit, surrounded by the very employees she had spent a lifetime looking down upon. Cassandra stepped out into the cool evening air, the city lights stretching out before her like a sea of possibilities. She signaled for her car, the weight of the Vance name finally feeling like a badge of office rather than a shackle. Behind her, the building was a tomb of old secrets. Ahead, the road was wide, dark, and entirely hers. She climbed into the back of the sedan, the door closing with a heavy, final thud that silenced the sirens in the distance. 6 months had passed since the glass shattered at the Vance Plaza, both literally and figuratively. Cassandra Vance sat in her new corner office, 40 floors above the city, where the air felt thinner and the silence was far more expensive. The scent of fresh, heavy stock paper and high-end espresso filled the room, a sharp contrast to the stale, mothballed atmosphere of her father's old regime. She adjusted the cuff of her charcoal wool blazer, her movements precise and unhurried. On her desk lay a final decree of liquidation. With one stroke of her pen, she had finished dismantling the last of the side businesses Arthur Vance had used to hide his personal debts. The man who had once ruled the city's skyline was now living in a 2-bedroom cottage in the suburbs, ignored by the country club set and forgotten by the board members who had once clamored for his favor. A soft chime echoed through the room. Julian Thorne stepped inside, his expression as unreadable as ever, though a flicker of professional pride danced in his eyes. He set a leather-bound folder on the mahogany surface. "The sentencing was finalized this morning," Julian said, his voice low. "Sloane Vance received 5 years. No possibility of early parole given the scale of the embezzlement and the federal nature of the wire fraud." Cassandra didn't look up immediately. She felt the weight of the words, a cold satisfaction that settled in her marrow like a slow-acting tonic. "And the restitution? The court seized everything," he replied. "The penthouse, the jewelry, the offshore accounts we flagged. She's left with the clothes she wore to the hearing. I'm told she had a bit of a breakdown when the bailiffs took her watch. It was the limited edition Piaget she bought with the operations budget." Cassandra finally met his gaze. She always did value the wrong things. An hour later, Cassandra found herself standing behind a thick pane of reinforced glass in the visitation wing of the county facility. The air here smelled of industrial bleach and desperation, a sensory assault that made her skin crawl. When the heavy steel door at the far end opened, a woman emerged who bore only a haunting resemblance to the sister she had known. Sloane was stripped of her armor. Her designer highlights had grown out into jagged, dark roots, and her skin looked sallow under the harsh fluorescent lights. The orange polyester jumpsuit hung off her frame, the cheap fabric pilling at the collar. When she sat down and picked up the receiver, her hands shook, the same hands that had once poured expensive wine over Cassandra's head with such casual cruelty. "You look like a ghost, Cassie," Sloane rasped, her voice cracking. The arrogance was still there, a flickering ember in a ruined fireplace. "Come to gloat, come to see the mess you made." "I didn't make this, Sloane," Cassandra said, her voice steady and devoid of the heat her sister clearly wanted. "You signed the documents. You moved the money. I simply stopped covering your tracks." Sloane's face contorted, her eyes welling with a frantic, ugly rage. She slammed her free hand against the glass, the dull thud echoing in the small cubicle. "You took everything. My house, my name, my life. Dad won't even take my calls. He says I destroyed the legacy." "The legacy was a lie built on the backs of people you considered beneath you," Cassandra replied. She watched as Sloane's face collapsed, the realization finally sinking in that there was no escape, no father to bail her out, and no sister left to bully. The entitlement that had been Sloane's oxygen was gone, leaving her gasping in the vacuum of her own consequences. Sloane leaned in close, her breath fogging the glass. "Please, just talk to the prosecutors. Tell them it was a mistake." "I can't stay here, Cassie. The bed is like a rock. The women here, they look at me like I'm nothing." "To them, you are nothing," Cassandra said, the words cold and final. "Just another number in a system you thought you were too rich to ever enter." She hung up the receiver before Sloane could scream. Through the glass, she watched her sister's silent breakdown. The heaving shoulders, the mouth opened in a wordless cry, the guard stepping in to haul her back toward the cells. It was the face slap Sloane had avoided her entire life, delivered not with a hand, but with the crushing weight of reality. Cassandra walked out into the biting autumn wind, the city lights beginning to twinkle like fallen stars. She had won. The Vance name was hers. The company was thriving, and the people who had tried to bury her were now the ones in the dirt. She climbed into the back of her car, the door closing with a heavy thud that signaled the end of the war. But as she looked at the empty seat beside her, she felt the sharp, lingering sting of the cost. She had saved the empire, but she had burned the family to do it. She was the queen of a mountain of ash, and as the car pulled away, she realized that the view from the top was breathtakingly lonely.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.